If you're new to Riverwood or have joined this online service for the first time, my name is Carolyn and I'm one of the pastors here. Have you ever failed to heed a warning? If you have, you know that there can be both embarrassing and costly consequences. Back in 2008, shortly after moving to a property just outside the city and still adjusting to the time needed to drive Carly to Sun Valley School, plus get myself to work on time, I chose not to ignore a very important sign, the 70-kilometer speed limit sign. I had never seen a radar car on my route, so I thought I was okay. But wouldn't you know it, on that day, I passed a car which very quickly turned around and came after me. As I stopped and rolled down my window, the friendly police officer said, "Ma'am, you're sure in a hurry today. Please slow down and here's a $175 ticket." Needless to say, I wasn't the only one frustrated with this extra expense. A couple weeks later, I received a letter from the city of Winnipeg with a speeding ticket. I thought to myself, that's really strange. I already have the ticket. I was completely confused. And that's when I discovered a beautiful photo of the back of my car driving through a 60-kilometer-per-hour construction zone at 80 kilometers. It happened a few days before I got my first ticket. Needless to say, I wasn't the only one upset about this added expense. Well, 3 days later, as I arrived home from picking up the kids at school, Todd hands me another letter from the city of Winnipeg through the same construction zone a few days after the first, and I now owed $625 in fines. Needless to say, I wasn't the only one frustrated. Okay, I thought, I've got to get my act together here. I'm going to be more careful. I'm going to pay attention to all the signs. 2 weeks later, I was driving home from church. Brittany was with me in the car and we were lost in conversation. And all of a sudden, Brittany shouts, "Mom, you just went through a red light," at a red light camera intersection. My collective bill now hit $850 in a matter of a month. Needless to say, I wasn't the only one upset. But Todd, in his gracious way, just laughed and said, "Well, maybe we can get a donation receipt for our generous contribution to the Winnipeg Police Service this year." We are all aware that there are warning signs to protect us, not only when we're driving, but in all areas of life. And it's up to us to heed those signs if we don't want to pay the consequences. Likewise, we will see in our teaching today a group of people that didn't heed the warnings given to them and what happened as a result. We've been reading through the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament as we continue our journey together as a church, reading one chapter of the Bible every day. If this is your first time joining us this month, the book of 2 Kings is a history of Israel and Judah's kings. You see, up until King Solomon, who was the son of King David, there was one Jewish nation called Israel. But after Solomon's death, there was a power struggle between two leaders, and the nation divided into two kingdoms. The southern kingdom was called Judah, and the northern kingdom was called Israel. Well, this northern kingdom had 19 kings in all, and each of these 19 kings shared a common legacy, each being described this way: "He did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord." Or it said, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." All 19 kings blew up their life, and in the end, their entire nation. The southern kingdom was a little bit better. They had 8 kings who followed the sacred pathway we heard about last week, and 12 kings who chose destructive paths. Well, today we're going to focus on the very last king of the Israel kingdom, King Hoshea. We find out in chapter 17 of 2 Kings that he reigned in Israel for 9 years. And like the legacy of his predecessors, it was also said of him, he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not to the same extent as the kings of Israel who ruled before him. However, in 722 BC, Assyria, the world's first mega empire, and one that had a reputation as terrorists who bullied and brutalized weaker nations throughout the Middle East, attacked Israel. And the author of 2 Kings, inspired by God, launches into a summary in chapter 17, reflecting on what led to the downfall of this kingdom. Let's open up our Bibles or Bible app and read from 2 Kings chapter 17, starting at verse 7. This disaster came upon the people of Israel because they worshipped other gods. They sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them safely out of Egypt and had rescued them from the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had followed the practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them, as well as the practices the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel had also secretly done many things that were not pleasing to the Lord their God. They built pagan shrines for themselves in all their towns, from the smallest outpost to the largest walled city. They set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles at the top of every hill and under every green tree. They offered sacrifices on all the hilltops, just like the nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of them. So the people of Israel had done many evil things, arousing the Lord's anger. Yes, they worshipped idols despite the Lord's specific and repeated warnings. Again and again, the Lord had sent his prophets and seers to warn both Israel and Judah. Turn from all your evil ways, obey my commands and decrees, the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I gave you through my servants, the prophets. But the Israelites would not listen. They were as stubborn as their ancestors who had refused to believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors, and they despised all his warnings. They worshipped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. They followed the example of the nations around them, disobeying the Lord's command not to imitate them. So in spite of all the warnings from such prophets as Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea, the Israelites dug in their heels. They rejected the divine advice. They turned against God's patient love and turned towards false gods and man-crafted idols. Let's read the end of verse 16 again. They worshipped worthless idols, so they became worthless themselves. One theologian described it this way: they worshipped emptiness and became empty. The Hebrew word here is hebel, meaning error or delusion or vanity. The idea is that they became like the gods they worshipped. They bowed down to nothingness and they became nothing. They worshipped emptiness and became empty. Is there a warning here for us today? Or do we just read through 2 Kings as we would a history textbook, skimming over the names of kings because it's really not relevant for us today? I would like to suggest to you that the struggle of these kings and their nations with idolatry, which is looking to something other than God to fill the emptiness in their lives, is just as much an issue in 2021 as it was in 722 BC. From chapter 17 in the book of 2 Kings, we find the seventh way that humankind tend to blow up their lives. And it is this: worshiping created things rather than the Creator. which is called idolatry. Let's review the 6 other ways we've looked at the last 2 weeks. Number 1 was pride. 2, exposing our life to poisonous people. 3, obeying God, but not fully. 4, trying to do everything yourself and failing to delegate. 5, living with small expectation and faith. And now 6, worshiping created things rather than the Creator. A couple hundred years prior to the fall of Israel to the Assyrians in 722 BC, the Israelites were given 10 clear commandments from God that would protect them from blowing up their lives. We find these commandments in Exodus chapter 20, which says, "Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me." And then with 9 commandments left, God gives a similar commandment to protect the people from falling into this trap of idolatry. The second commandment is this: you must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For many of us, those commandments may seem to be the easiest of the 10 to follow. I probably wouldn't find any of you in a wood shop carving an idol or melting your gold jewelry into a statue to worship. Idolatry sometimes seems to be a thing of the past, something foreign to a Canadian in the year 2021. Or do we have idols today that are just as tangible as a wooden statue or a golden calf, but are shaped differently? Tim Keller, in his book Counterfeit Gods, describes an idol this way: it is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. You see, there's an emptiness in each of us that can only be fulfilled or satisfied by the love of God. But like the Israelites of long ago, we get stubborn. We despise God's warning in Scripture. We reject his ways and we turn to things other than him to fill that void in our lives. And to see where we are at today with this, I'm going to give you a test. I know many of us have gotten COVID tests over the past year and a half, and like that COVID test, this may be a little uncomfortable as we reach deep inside our hearts and put things under the microscope. But what these questions will end up revealing will eventually protect us if we heed the warnings. Here we go. Do you prioritize anything or anyone before God? Do you place your identity in anything over your status as a child of God? Do you look to anything or anyone to meet your needs instead of God? Do you seek fulfillment or satisfaction from anything outside of God? Do you seek comfort outside of God? Now, this doesn't mean that it's wrong to find satisfaction and fulfillment in the things of life and in relationships. But if we are going to God as a last resort instead of a first response, it tends to reveal that someone else or something else is winning the contest for the throne in our hearts. One warning to heed so that we don't blow up our life is to seek our Creator God for the unconditional love we crave, for the peace that will calm our soul, for a restored hope for the future, because His love is a perfect love. We're going to take a look now at a few of the most common idols in 2021. But first, let's review the definition of idolatry from pastor and author Tim Keller. It is anything more important to you than God, anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God, anything you seek to give you what only God can give. So here are a few modern-day idols that actually all start with the letter P. We'll begin with personal identity. Our culture puts a lot of emphasis on personal identity, your outward appearance, the degree behind your name, your sexual identity, your career, your title at work, your social status. And all over the continent, people are bowing down to the idol of identity, becoming more and more absorbed with self and personal significance, forgetting or rejecting that our significance is found in who God says we are. When we stop bowing down to the idol of personal identity, seeking significance in something other than Christ, the striving can cease, and the burden that we carry to measure up eases. When we choose to follow Christ, our identity radically changes. But often, we keep bowing down to this God of identity, striving for accolades, for affirmation, and more accomplishments, but feeling less and less significant. Jesus said, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul?" As a follower of Christ, this is what God says about you. You are a chosen people. You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And as a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. It says in 1 Peter 2:4. Secondly is the idol of people. People? Really? You might be thinking, I bow down to no one. Or do you? Now, relationships are a good and precious gift, but sometimes good things can become God things. We search for fulfillment from our friends, our significant other, our spouse, our children, rather than from Christ. And that categorizes them as an idol in our lives and only sets them up for failure. You know, as a young wife 35 years ago, I fell into this trap so often. I expected Todd to meet my needs for emotional fulfillment that were way beyond his capability. He can do a lot of things, but he's not God. My dependence on him to meet those deepest needs only left me complaining and him frustrated. When we depend on our spouse or significant other or our friends to provide all of the comfort, all of the encouragement, all of the validation, all of the love, we're going to walk away disappointed because only God can fill the deepest longings of our soul. The people that God brings into our life are simply added gifts from him to enhance and enrich our lives, not to fulfill our every single longing. The place to have those deepest longings met is only through Christ. When I developed the daily practice of spending time each morning opening my Bible and allowing God to speak to me through his powerful, relevant word, the more dependent I became on him and the less demanding I became of Todd. Friends, when we seek God, our character grows and we become better friends, better partners, better parents. We need to love our people well, but we will blow up our life and our relationship when we become consumed with that relationship before Christ? Are you looking for a person to fulfill a need that only God can fill? Thirdly, possessions can become an idol. It doesn't matter if you have money or if you're broke. The pursuit of money and the acquisition of things is an idol our culture bows down to, and a trap even Christians fall into. We sacrifice so much on the altar of the God of possessions, hoping we will find significance and satisfaction. And often the things that get sacrificed are our physical health, our character, our marriage, our children. Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." The Israelites back in 2 Kings chapter 17 received warning after warning to be devoted to God. But as we read in verses 14 and 15, they wouldn't listen. They were stubborn. They refused to believe. They rejected and despised what God said. They were enslaved to the gods of the culture around them. Let's do things differently. Let's heed the warnings and be devoted to God and not make possessions and money a priority in our life. The last idol I would like to talk about today is the idol of pleasure. Pastor Kyle Idleman says that one of the reasons these gods are so hard to spot is because false gods can begin as a gift from the Lord. But when a gift from God takes his place, it's only a matter of time before destruction follows. The promise of pleasure is enticing, but when it's outside of God's plan, it delivers pain. Oh, it promises fulfillment, but when we turn to pleasure for comfort rather than to God, we end up feeling emptier than ever. Yes, pleasure promises happiness, but when it's outside of God's directives, it brings heartbreak. In 1 Corinthians, God says this through the Apostle Paul, "You say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I am allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything. You say food was made for the stomach and the stomach for food. This is true, though someday God will do away with both of them. But you can't say that our bodies were made for sexual immorality. They were made for the Lord, and the Lord cares about our bodies." And then jumping down to verse 18, it says, "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. Don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You don't belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. So honor God with your body." Like the Israelites, we often refuse to listen. And then one day we wake up wondering, how in the world did I get to this place where I'm enslaved to something that is only leaving me feeling more and more empty? Well, it's often because we haven't heeded God's warning. The commands and the directives that he gives us are not there to take away joy and fulfillment in life. They are there to protect us. One pastor put it this way: anytime God says don't, you can follow it up with hurt yourself. Don't hurt yourself. The kings and the people of Israel ended up hurting themselves and their entire nation because they worshiped other gods, bowing their lives down to the empty and becoming empty. There are so many more modern day idols that we could talk about, but we simply don't have time today. However, let's be aware that idols and idolatry are just as commonplace today as they were in the time of 2 Kings. Let's choose today to heed the warning signs, to stay far away from worshiping created things over our Creator. Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief, which means Satan, or it can mean false gods and modern-day idols of our culture, they come only to steal and kill and destroy. But Jesus said, I have come that people may have life and have it to the full. It is only in an everyday pursuit of Jesus that we experience real life, true love, fresh strength, and genuine hope. Let's make him the passion of our life.